I got $52 and a dead man's last wish. That's all I got, friend. Jake Harrison's hands froze over the engine block. He hadn't moved in 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like the rest of his life stacking up behind him like unpaid bills. The garage was his father's, his grandfather's. And in 6 hours, it wouldn't be any of those things anymore. If you've ever stood at the edge of losing everything that matters, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't you dare leave before the end. The clock on the wall of Harrison's garage read 12:04 in the morning, and Jake Harrison hadn't slept in 31 hours. He knew because he'd been counting. Not intentionally, it was the kind of counting a man does when sleep stops feeling like something he deserves. Every hour that passed was another hour closer to 9 a.m. when Grant Mercer's lawyers would walk through that door with paperwork that would strip the name Harrison off the building his grandfather had built with borrowed tools and borrowed time on the edge of Route 66 back in 1959. $93,000. That was the number. Jake had written it on a scrap of paper 3 weeks ago and then burned that paper in the parking lot because he didn't want to look at it anymore. But burning paper doesn't burn numbers. They stay with you. They sit behind your eyes when you try to sleep. They whisper to you when you're standing at a workbench pretending to be useful. He was pretending right now. The socket wrench in his hand hadn't moved in 10 minutes. He was staring at a 2003 Ford F-150 that belonged to a regular customer named Pete Galvez, a retired school teacher who needed new brake pads and a fluid flush. Simple job. Jake had done it 1,000 times. Tonight, he couldn't make himself start. Because what was the point? In 6 hours, this garage, the lift, the compressor, the hand-painted sign above the door, the framed photograph of his father shaking hands with a man on a motorcycle somewhere in New Mexico in 1974, all of it would belong to Grant Mercer. Or more accurately, it would belong to whatever holding company Mercer was using this month to swallow up small businesses along the old highway corridor. Jake set the wrench down on the workbench and pressed both palms flat against the metal surface. He breathed. The garage smelled like oil and rubber, and something underneath that, something older, like wood and time, and the particular kind of dust that settles in a place where people have worked hard for decades. He'd grown up breathing that smell. His daughter Emma had taken her first steps on this concrete floor. His wife Carol had brought him lunch here every Friday for 19 years, until she couldn't anymore. 14 months, that was how long Carol had been gone. 14 months and the world had continued its absolute indifference to the fact that the best person Jake Harrison had ever known was no longer in it. He reached into the pocket of his coveralls and pulled out his phone. No messages. He didn't know who he expected to hear from at midnight, but the emptiness of the screen confirmed something he already understood: he was alone in this. His daughter was in Phoenix 3 hours away, and he hadn't told her how bad it had gotten because he didn't know how to say it without it sounding like failure. His brother Dennis had offered to loan him money back in March, but Dennis had his own kids, his own mortgage, and Jake had said no thank you and changed the subject. Pride is a complicated thing. It holds you up and it holds you down simultaneously, and most men Jake's age had never learned to tell the difference. He was about to turn off the main bay lights, not because he planned to sleep, just because sitting in the dark felt more honest than pretending to work, when he heard it. Footsteps. On the gravel outside, Jake turned. Through the open bay door in the thin reach of the parking lot light, he saw a man walking. Not a young man. This man moved with the particular weight of someone who had covered a lot of miles in his lifetime, not all of them on flat ground. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a leather jacket that had been through weather Jake couldn't begin to guess at. His gray hair was pulled back, and his beard was the kind that didn't come from fashion. It came from months on the road where shaving wasn't a priority. He was pushing a motorcycle, a Harley Davidson from the shape of it, though it wasn't moving under its own power. The man had both hands on the handlebars and was leaning into it the way you lean into something that isn't cooperating, something that has let you down, but that you refuse to abandon. Jake watched him for a moment. The man didn't look up. He just kept pushing, steady and deliberate, until he reached the edge of the bay door and stopped. He looked up then. His eyes were the color of creek water. In winter, not cold exactly, but clear in a way that made you feel like he could see more than you were showing. "You open?" he asked. Jake almost laughed. It was midnight. The sign above the door said closed. The parking lot was empty, Anyone with functional eyesight could see that Harrison's garage was not open for business. "I'm here," Jake said instead, which wasn't the same thing, but it was honest. The man nodded as if that was exactly the answer he'd expected. "Name's Dylan Cross. My bike gave out about a mile and a half back, just past the old motel." He paused. "She's been giving me trouble since Albuquerque, but I thought I could push her through." Push her through to where? Dylan Cross looked at Jake for a moment before he answered. "The Pacific Ocean." Jake waited. "I know how that sounds," Dylan said, "but it's not a figure of speech. I've got a specific beach in mind, Malibu, and I've got a specific reason." He reached into the left saddlebag slowly, deliberately, the way a careful man reaches for something fragile, and brought out a metal container. It was a simple canister, matte gray, the kind you can buy at any funeral home. He held it for just a second, then put it back. "That's Roy," Dylan said. "Roy Briggs. We rode together for 31 years. He passed in February. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't give a man time to say everything he meant to say." Dylan's jaw tightened briefly, then released. Roy had one request. He wanted his ashes put in the Pacific. He grew up in Kansas. Never saw the ocean. Always said he'd get there. A pause. He didn't get there. Jake stood very still. "So I'm getting him there," Dylan said. "Or I'm trying to, if I can get this bike running." Silence settled between them. Outside Route 66 was empty in both directions. Somewhere in the desert darkness, a coyote called once and went quiet. Jake looked at the Harley. Even from a distance, he could see things that concerned him: the way she sat slightly wrong, the lean that suggested frame or fork, trouble, the general look of a machine that had been pushed past what it was reasonably asked to do. He looked at Dylan Cross. "You got money?" Jake asked. It wasn't a cruel question. It was a necessary one. He had 6 hours until his own financial ruin arrived. He was not in a position to work for free. Dylan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded collection of bills. He counted them there in the bay door, deliberately, without embarrassment. $52, he said. "That's what I've got. I know it's not close to enough for whatever this needs. I know that." He folded the bills and held them out anyway. "But it's everything I have, and everything I have is Roy's right now." Jake stared at the money. $52. He owed $93,000. He had 6 hours. He hadn't slept in 31. Every reasonable corner of his brain said to send this man on his way. Call him a tow truck if he felt generous. Point him toward the motel down the road. Wish him luck and go back to sitting in the dark thinking about Carol and the smell of old wood and unpaid debt. Every reasonable corner. "Bring her in," Jake said. Dylan Cross looked at him with those creek-water eyes. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The expression of a man who has learned not to expect much from the world and is briefly, quietly proven wrong. "You sure?" Dylan asked. "I said bring her in," Jake repeated, and he moved to help push the Harley over the threshold into the light. The moment the bike cleared the bay door and Jake got his hands on her, he understood that this was not going to be a simple job. The Harley was a 2001 Road King, originally a fine machine, but she had been ridden hard and long, and not always by someone with the resources to maintain her properly. Jake walked around her, once hands at his sides, just looking. Then he crouched by the engine housing and felt his stomach drop. "Come here," Jake said. Dylan crouched beside him. Jake pointed to a fracture along the lower engine housing. It wasn't hairline, it was a genuine crack, the kind that doesn't happen overnight. The kind that happens when a machine is pushed beyond its engineering for too long and the metal finally says enough. "How long has she been running like this?" Jake asked. "Since about Tucson," Dylan said. "She started knocking. I adjusted what I could and kept going. You rode her 200 miles with this crack. Roy doesn't have time for me to stop." Jake looked at him sideways. Dylan said it with complete seriousness, and Jake understood that the man meant it exactly as he said it, that some debts to the dead operate on their own timeline, indifferent to mechanical reality. "There's more," Jake said. He moved to the front fork. He pressed down and then released, watching the response. Wrong. The alignment was off, which meant the handling was compromised, which meant Dylan Cross had ridden a fundamentally dangerous machine through desert highway at night. "You know this could have killed you," Jake said. "Not an accusation, a fact." "I'm aware," Dylan said, "and you kept going. Roy would have done the same for me." Jake stood up. He put his hands on his hips and looked at the bike and then at the clock on the wall. 12:19 a.m. and then at nothing in particular while he did math in his head. Not financial math, mechanical math. The kind his father had taught him, the kind that lived in his hands as much as his brain. The engine housing crack would require a custom repair. He couldn't simply replace the part without a week's wait for shipping, and Dylan Cross did not have a week. He would have to machine something. By hand. Tonight. The fork alignment was several hours of careful work. There were almost certainly other issues he hadn't found yet. He looked at Dylan Cross. "You want coffee?" he asked. Dylan almost smiled. "If you're making it." Jake walked to the back of the garage where he kept an old percolator on a shelf next to a row of oil containers and a photograph of his father that he'd put there years ago and never moved. He filled the percolator and set it going, and then he stood there for a second looking at his father's face in the photograph. His father, Raymond Harrison, who had built this garage with those specific hands in that specific photograph, who had told Jake more times than Jake could count that a man's worth is measured by what he does when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for him. "You watching, Pop?" Jake said quietly, so Dylan couldn't hear. The percolator bubbled. Jake poured 2 cups and carried them back to the bay. Dylan had sat down on an overturned crate near the workbench. He held the cup with both hands like it was something precious. They drank in silence for a moment. "How'd you hear about this place?" Jake asked. "Didn't," Dylan said. "Saw the light on." "It's midnight." "I know what time it is." Dylan looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Why are you still here at midnight?" Jake could have said the honest thing, lawyer's debt foreclosure, Carol, all of it. Instead, he said, "Couldn't sleep." Dylan nodded, and from the way he nodded, Jake suspected the man understood there was more beneath that answer than 2 words could carry. He didn't push. "Tell me about Roy," Jake said, instead moving to the workbench and beginning to pull tools. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then Roy Briggs was the most stubborn, infuriating, loyal human being I've ever known. He grew up in Wichita. His father was a wheat farmer. Roy wanted nothing to do with farming. He saved up for 4 years and bought a motorcycle when he was 22 and basically never looked back. A pause. "We met at a rally in Oklahoma in 1991. He told me within 10 minutes of meeting me that I was doing something wrong with my carburetor. He was right. I hated him for it." Something close to a laugh moved through Dylan's voice. 3 days later, we were riding together like we'd been doing it for years. Jake had moved to his machining setup in the corner of the shop. He was examining the crack in the housing, measuring, thinking. His hands were already calculating the work ahead. But he was listening. Completely. "He never made it to the coast?" Jake asked. "Life kept happening," Dylan said. "You know how it is. There's always something. A glum, a family obligation, money being tight, somebody getting sick." Roy kept saying next summer for about 20 years. The weight of that settled between them. Then there wasn't a next summer. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew exactly how that felt. He thought of all the things he told Carol they'd do when things calmed down. Sedona, the Grand Canyon Rim at sunrise, a trip to see Emma more than twice a year. Things that would happen when life got less complicated. Life had not gotten less complicated. Life had ended. "When did he go?" Jake asked. "February 14th, Dylan said. "Valentine's Day." Roy had a dark sense of humor about it right up to the end. He said, "At least nobody's going to forget the anniversary." Jake stopped what he was doing for just a second. Then he started again. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," Dylan said. Simple, real. They worked in silence after that, or rather Jake worked, and Dylan sat occasionally moving to hand Jake a tool when it was clear what he needed without being asked. There was something in that. The man understood garage work enough to know when to stay out of the way and when to be useful. Those were 2 different skills, and a lot of people never learned either. At 1:15 a.m., Jake discovered the third problem. The rear brake line had a stress fracture invisible from outside, the kind that would have failed catastrophically at highway speed, possibly within the next 50 miles. He held it up under the light and stared at it. Then he looked at Dylan. "Did you know about this?" Dylan looked at the line. His expression didn't waver exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't know." "This would have killed you," Jake said. "Not might have. Would have. 100 miles from here, or maybe 50. This lets go and you go down at speed on a desert highway, and Roy never gets to the ocean because you're both dead." Dylan said nothing for a long moment. Then, How bad is all of it, honestly? Jake leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. The crack in the housing I can fix, but I have to machine a reinforcement plate by hand. I don't have the right part, and there's no way to get one tonight. The fork alignment is several hours of work. This brake line has to be replaced entirely. He paused. It's not one problem. It's four problems that have been building on each other for a long time. Can you fix it? By morning, Ayah. I need to be riding by morning. Jake looked at the clock. 1:22 a.m., 7 hours. Maybe 7.5 if Mercer's people were late. Yes, Jake said, I can fix it. He said it before he'd fully thought it through. But once it was out, he knew it was true. Not because it was easy, because it was the kind of work his hands understood and his father had trained him for, and the garage had been built for. Because Roy Briggs had never seen the Pacific Ocean, and Dylan Cross had ridden a broken bike 200 miles through the Arizona desert to correct that injustice, and that fact had weight. Go sit down, Jake told him. This is going to take a while. Dylan Cross sat down. After a moment, he said, What's your name? You never told me. Jake Harrison. Jake Harrison. Dylan turned the name over like he was checking its quality. This your place? For another few hours, Jake said quietly and turned back to the work. Dylan heard it. The way Dylan's silence changed quality after Jake said that it wasn't indifference. It was the kind of listening a man does when he's heard something important and is deciding how to hold it. But he didn't ask, and Jake didn't explain. The machining was the hardest part. Working metal by hand at 2 a.m. with tired eyes and the specific kind of grief that lives in the hands as much as the heart, Jake lost himself in it. This was the only place despair couldn't fully reach him. The work required him completely. Every measurement had to be right. Every angle mattered. There was no room in the mathematics of machining for the thought of Carol's empty chair at the kitchen table or Mercer's lawyers in their pressed suits standing at his bay door in 6 hours. Just the metal, just the measurement, just his father's hands moving through his hands. At 2:47 a.m., Dylan Cross spoke quietly from his crate. You loved it, he said. Not a question. Jake looked up. What? This place. You can see it in how you work. The way you move around in here, you know every inch. Dylan looked at the walls, the tools hung in their places, the shelves, the old clock, the photograph. You grew up here. My grandfather built it in '59, Jake said. My father took it over in '78. I've been here since I was old enough to hand him a wrench. And now Jake was quiet for a few seconds. Then $93,000. That's what I owe a man named Grant Mercer. His lawyers come at 9. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out because 3 a.m. has a way of dissolving the walls men build around the things they can't face. Dylan Cross said nothing immediately. He sat with it the way a man sits with something that deserves its own silence. What happened? Dylan finally asked. Medical bills, Jake said. My wife. She fought for 8 months and the insurance covered maybe half of what it cost. The rest went on credit. I took a second mortgage, then a third. He kept working as he talked because stopping felt impossible. Mercer bought the debt from the original creditor. Bought it cheap like they do, and then started adding fees and interest the original terms didn't include. By the time I had a lawyer look at it, the number had grown from 60,000 to 93 in 14 months. That's predatory, Dylan said. His voice had changed. Something harder had come into it. That's legal, Jake said, and the bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Dylan was quiet again. Then carefully, what was her name? Jake's hands slowed for just a moment. Just one. Carol, he said. The name sat in the oil and rubber air of Harrison's garage at 3 a.m, and it was the most real thing in the room. She would have hated this, Jake said. The situation. Not the garage, she would have fought for it. She would have had a plan. She always had a plan. His voice was level, but his eyes were not. He kept them on his work. That's the part I can't get past. Not just missing her. I mean, I miss her every single minute of every single day. But the part I can't get past is that she would have known what to do and I don't. Dylan Cross looked at Jake Harrison for a long moment, and then he said something Jake would think about for years afterward. You're doing it, Dylan said. Right now, you're doing exactly what she would have done. You couldn't sleep in the middle of your worst night, so you stayed at your workbench, and when somebody in trouble showed up at your door, you let them in and you started working. He paused. That's not failure. That's who you are, and it sounds to me like it's who she loved. Jake didn't say anything. He couldn't. He kept working. The night wore on in the particular way that nights do when the work is hard and the stakes are real, and the silence between two people has become honest rather than empty. Dylan brewed more coffee around 4 a.m. He found the percolator on his own. He refilled Jake's cup without asking and set it on the edge of the workbench where Jake could reach it. The fork alignment took until just past 5. Jake's lower back was screaming by then, and his hands had the particular tremor that comes from sustained precision work through exhaustion. But the alignment was right. He checked it 3 times. The brake line replacement was cleaner. He had the parts, and the work was familiar. Still, it was 40 minutes he hadn't counted on in his mental schedule. The engine housing was the masterpiece. The reinforcement plate he'd machined from raw steel stock fit with the particular satisfying exactness of a thing made by hand to fit a specific need. When he seated it and secured it and then put his hand flat against the housing and felt its solidity, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Old, quiet, uncomplicated pride. "She's ready," he said. It was 6:51 a.m. Dylan Cross stood up from the crate. He moved to the bike and put his hands on the handlebars. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that matters. "Will she make it?" he asked. "Honestly." "The repairs I made are solid," Jake said. "The rest of her is tired, but she'll hold. You ride sensibly and she'll get you to Malibu." Dylan looked at him. "You've been at this all night." "Yeah." "You've got lawyers coming in 2 hours." "Yeah." "And you fixed my bike for $52. Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I fixed Roy's bike," he said. "The 52 was just so you didn't feel like you owed me something." Something happened in Dylan Cross's face. It wasn't quite emotion, or rather it was, but the controlled kind, the kind that men of a certain age have had years to learn to manage. His jaw set and his eyes went very direct, and he nodded once slowly as though confirming something to himself. "Jake Harrison," he said, "Yeah. I'm going to remember that." "You don't have to." "I'm going to anyway," Dylan said. "Now, help me get her started." They pushed the Road King out into the early morning, where the sun was just beginning to separate the sky from the horizon in the particular way it does over Arizona desert. Not dramatic exactly, but immense. The way things are when the scale is beyond what human eyes were built to process comfortably. Dylan mounted the bike. He settled his weight, reached into the left saddlebag, and placed his hand briefly against Roy's canister. "Almost there, brother," he said quietly. He kicked her over. The Harley-Davidson Road King started on the first try. The engine turned over with a deep, clean authority, not loud, not showy, but right. The kind of sound that comes from a machine that has been properly understood and properly repaired by someone who knew what they were doing. Jake stood in the parking lot of Harrison's garage on Route 66 in Arizona at 6:58 in the morning with 2 hours until everything his family had built was taken from him, and he listened to that engine and he felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly. He was too tired and too honest for hope, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt briefly like it was going to be enough to get him through to whatever came next. Dylan Cross looked at him from the seat of the motorcycle. He reached out and put one hand briefly on Jake's shoulder, the old gesture of men who have been through something together, the kind of handshake that happens without using hands. "Thank you, Jake Harrison," he said. "Get Roy to the ocean," Jake said. Dylan nodded. He put the bike in gear, and he rode west toward the Pacific carrying a dead man's last wish and $52 worth of the best work Jake Harrison had ever done down the long, straight burn of Route 66 as the sun came up and the desert turned gold around it, and Jake stood in the parking lot and watched until the sound of that engine faded into the distance and the silence came back. He stood there for one more minute in the quiet. Then he went back inside his father's garage to wait for the lawyers. He had 2 hours. He had $93,000 in debt. He had no plan and no money and no idea what came next. But the Harley Road King was running clean and true somewhere out there on the highway to California, and for reasons Jake Harrison could not have explained to anyone who asked, that felt like it mattered more than he could understand yet. Jake went back inside and stood in the middle of his shop floor and did the only thing he knew how to do when the world was collapsing around him. He cleaned up. He put the tools back in their places. He wiped down the workbench. He rolled the Ford F-150 belonging to Pete Galvez, the job he still hadn't finished, back into the corner bay and covered it with a drop cloth, because Pete was going to need his truck back, whether or not Jake Harrison still owned a garage to work on it in. That kind of thinking, the thinking that kept obligations to other people, even when your own world was ending, was something Raymond Harrison had put into his son before Jake was old enough to argue about it. Take care of what you owe first, then fall apart if you need to. Jake didn't feel like falling apart. He felt like something past that, something quieter and more final, like a machine that has simply run out of the particular fuel that kept it going. He pulled a metal folding chair to the center of the bay floor, sat down in it, and looked at the space around him. 61 years of Harrison family work lived in these walls. Not metaphorically, literally. The shelves his grandfather had built from salvage lumber. The alignment rack his father had saved for 3 years to buy. The hand-lettered price board above the register that hadn't been updated since 1987, because his father always said the prices were on a piece of paper by the phone, and the board was history, not advertising. The coffee can of spare bolts that had been sitting on the second shelf from the left for as long as Jake could remember, always full. Because his father said you never knew when someone was going to need exactly one bolt, and you should be the man who had it. Jake sat in that chair at 7:14 in the morning and let himself feel completely and without defense what it meant to lose this place. He'd been holding it at arm's length for months, the way you hold grief at arm's length when you can't afford to let it land. Carol's death had taught him that trick: you keep moving, because moving prevents drowning. But there is always a moment when the water catches up. This was the moment. He stayed in it for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock, and he let himself watch it because watching the clock meant confronting the fact that at 9 a.m. something was coming that he could not stop, and confronting that fact meant he wasn't running from it anymore. At 7:25, he stood up, folded the chair, and hung it on its hook on the wall. Then he walked to the small office at the back of the garage, sat down at the desk that had been his father's desk, and picked up the phone. He called his daughter. Emma picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she had probably been lying there worrying, because Emma Harrison had her mother's instincts, and she'd known for weeks that something was wrong, even though Jake had said very little. "Dad?" Her voice was careful in the way that people are careful when they're braced. "Morning, Em. It's 7:30. "I know." A pause, then, "How bad is it?" Jake closed his eyes, opened them to him. "Lawyers are coming at 9. It's Mercer. He's got the paper on everything, the building, the property, the equipment." He kept his voice flat because if he let it wobble, he wasn't going to get through this. "I wanted you to know before it happened, not after." The silence on Emma's end was the kind that has weight. Then he heard her breathe one sharp, controlled breath that told him she was doing the same thing he was doing, which was holding herself together by sheer determination. "I'm coming," she said. "You don't have to, Dad." Her voice cracked once, then steadied. "Don't you dare tell me I don't have to. I'm coming." Jake said nothing for a moment. Then, "Okay, I'll be there by 10. Emma, I know it might already be done by then. I'm still coming." A beat. "Have you slept?" "No, of course not." He could hear her moving, the sound of her grabbing things, her keys. "Did you eat anything?" "I had coffee." "That's not food, Dad. It's food adjacent." A sound that was almost a laugh and also almost a cry, that particular combination that only happens in families where people love each other enough to make jokes when jokes are the only alternative to breaking. "I'll bring food," she said. "I love you." "I love you too, Em." He hung up the phone and sat for a moment with his hand still on the receiver. Then he got up and made another pot of coffee. At 8:03, a car pulled into the lot. Jake looked up from the workbench. It wasn't a lawyer's car, not yet. It was a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and the man who got out of it was Pete Galvez, Jake's regular customer, the retired school teacher who needed brake pads and a fluid flush on the truck Jake hadn't finished. Pete was 68 years old, small and precise in his movements. With white hair, he kept cut short, in a habit of wearing button-down shirts even to a mechanic's appointment. Because, as he had once explained to Jake, you dress respectfully for the people you respect. He stopped when he saw Jake's face. "You look terrible," Pete said. "Morning, Pete." "Seriously, Jake, you look like you lost a fight with a calendar." Pete came inside slowly, looking around at the garage, at Jake, at the general atmosphere of a place where something had been happening that wasn't ordinary. "Is something wrong?" Jake considered lying. It would have been easy. He was tired enough that the lie would have come out smooth. Instead, he said, "Lawyers are coming at 9 to take the building, Pete. I wanted to get your truck done before that happened, but I didn't quite make it. I'll make sure you get it back, even if I have to." He stopped. He actually didn't know how to finish that sentence, which told him something about how much he hadn't planned beyond this morning. Pete Galvez stood very still. Then he said, "Lawyers. Mercer, he bought my debt." "Grant Mercer." Pete said the name the way you say the name of something you've already identified as a problem without surprise, just confirmation. "I know who he is. Half the businesses on this stretch of 66 know who he is." He looked at Jake directly. "How much?" "Pete, you don't need to." "How much, Jake?" 93,000. Pete nodded slowly the way a man nods when the number is worse than he was ready for. But he's not going to show that. He looked around the garage one more time. Then he pulled out his phone and started making a call. "What are you doing?" Jake asked. "Calling Frank DeLuca," Pete said. "He runs the diner on the north end. He's been dealing with Mercer's people since January. They were trying to take his parking lot. He's going to want to know about this." He held the phone to his ear and looked at Jake. "This is what we do, Jake. This is what people do." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He just watched Pete Galvez make the call and felt something stir in his chest that he wasn't ready to name. At 8:31, Grant Mercer arrived. He came 43 minutes ahead of his own lawyers, and he came alone, which told Jake something that Mercer wanted a private conversation before the official proceedings, which meant Mercer wanted to offer something, which meant Mercer was either being generous or setting up something worse. Grant Mercer was 54 years old, which meant he was younger than Jake, a fact Jake had always found obscurely offensive. He dressed expensively in the way that men dress expensively when they want you to understand immediately that money is their primary language. He got out of a car that cost more than Jake's annual revenue in a good year and walked toward the bay door with the particular walk of someone who has never in recent memory walked into a room where he wasn't the one with the most leverage. He stopped at the bay door entrance and looked in. "Jake," he said, like they were friendly. "Mercer." Jake didn't move from the workbench. "You look like you've been up all night." "I have." Mercer came in a few steps, hands loose at his sides, a careful expression of reasonable concern on his face that Jake had long ago identified as the expression men wear when they want to appear fair while doing something that isn't. "I came early because I wanted to give you one more chance to talk before the lawyers make everything formal and expensive." "Talk about what?" "A sale," Mercer said. "A clean transaction. You sign the building over today, I clear the debt, and I give you 60 days to relocate your operations." He paused. "That's actually generous, Jake. Most of my transactions aren't that generous." Jake looked at him for a long moment. The coffee was still warm. Outside, Pete Galvez was on his third phone call. "My grandfather built this building in 1959, Jake said. "I know," Mercer said, "and that's a good story. But a good story doesn't service a $93,000 debt. The debt you manufactured." Something shifted in Mercer's face, not guilt. Nothing close to guilt, but the particular adjustment of a man who has been caught using exact language when he expected approximation. "I acquired a legitimate debt instrument and—" "You bought a $60,000 note for 12 cents on the dollar," Jake said, and then added fees that weren't in the original terms and called it $93,000. "You've done it to 11 other properties on this highway in the last 4 years. Frank DeLuca's parking lot, the Navarro family's motel, the—" "Jake." Mercer's voice got quieter, which is the direction dangerous things tend to go. "So, this isn't productive." "No," Jake agreed. "It's not." He turned back to the workbench. "I'll see your lawyers at 9. The silence behind him was the kind that men like Mercer use as a weapon, the silence that's supposed to make you turn around and reconsider, because powerful men's silences carry the implication that you can't afford to ignore them. Jake did not turn around. He heard Mercer's footsteps retreat to the bay door. Then Mercer stopped. "This is going to go the way it goes, Jake," he said. "I've done this enough times to know." "I'm sure you have," Jake said to the workbench. Mercer left. Jake's hands were shaking slightly against the metal surface. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From something rawer than fear, the particular physical response of a body that has been running on grief and exhaustion and caffeine for 30-something hours and is now being asked to also manage rage. He breathed. He got it back under control. Pete Galvez appeared at the bay door. He'd heard some of that, from his expression, enough of it. Frank DeLuca is coming, Pete said, and Maria Sandoval from the flower shop. And I think Tom Reeves, you know Tom, he fixes air conditioners on the east side. Mercer tried to take his equipment last year. Jake stared at him. Pete, don't say you don't want help, Pete said firmly. Your father changed my brakes for 22 years and never once overcharged me. Your grandfather fixed my father's car in 1963 when my father had $4 in his pocket and he told him to pay when he could. I have been paying that debt back in the only way I know how, which is being here when a Harrison needs someone to be here. He crossed his arms. So don't say you don't want help. Jake looked at this man, this small, precise, button-shirted man who had driven over at 8 in the morning with his phone already to his ear and felt something in the region of his throat that he refused to let go any further. Thank you, Pete, he said. Don't thank me, Pete said. Just make the coffee. At 8:52, Mercer's lawyers arrived. Two of them, a woman named Sandra Voss, who carried her briefcase like a weapon, and a younger man named Davis, who said nothing and wrote things down. They set up at the small table in Jake's office with the efficiency of people who had done this particular thing many times and considered it routine. Jake sat across from them. Pete Galvez sat beside him, which wasn't something Jake had asked for or expected. Pete had simply walked in and sat down, and his presence had a quality to it, the presence of a man who is there on purpose and knows it. Mr. Harrison, Sandra Voss began arranging her documents with the deliberate unhurry of someone who believes time is on their side. The purpose of this meeting is to formalize the transfer of the property at... The phone rang. Jake's shop phone, the old landline on the corner of the desk that had been the same number since 1979. It rang 3 times before Jake registered that it was real. I need to get that, he said. Sandra Voss looked at her watch. Mr. Harrison, we're on a tight... Jake picked up the phone. Harrison's garage. The voice on the other end was not a voice he recognized. It was a man older, calm in the way that people are calm when they are very certain of what they are doing. Jake Harrison, the voice said. Not a question. Yes. My name is Marcus Kane. I'm an attorney in Phoenix. I got your name from a mutual friend about 40 minutes ago. I need you to do something very important right now. A pause. Do not sign anything. Jake's whole body went still. He was aware of Sandra Voss across the desk watching him. He turned slightly away from her. Who? He started. Dylan Cross called me, Marcus Kane said. He stopped at a gas station outside of Wickenburg and used a payphone, if you can believe that, because he didn't want to stop longer than that. He told me what's happening, and he told me where you are. Another pause, and now Jake could hear something in the man's voice that was not just calm, it was focused the way attorneys get focused when they have found something. I know Grant Mercer's operation, Mr. Harrison. I have been tracking his debt acquisition practices in Maricopa and Yavapai counties for 8 months. And I believe I need to confirm, but I believe strongly, that the debt instrument he used on your property was acquired in violation of Arizona Revised Statute 6132, which governs predatory transfer of consumer and small business debt. Jake said nothing. He was processing too fast and too slow simultaneously. If I'm right, Marcus Kane continued, the foreclosure action is not just challengeable. It's invalid, temporarily but meaningfully invalid, which means we have grounds to file for an emergency injunction, which means we can stop today's proceedings before they become binding. Jake's hand tightened on the phone receiver. He was acutely aware of Sandra Voss, who had stopped arranging her papers and was watching him now, with an expression that had shifted from routine professional patience to something more attentive. What do you need from me? Jake asked. Copies of every document Mercer's team has sent you. Every notice, every letter, every demand. Can you scan and email them? I have them, yes. Do it now, and do not sign anything while I am reviewing them. Understood. One more thing, Mr. Harrison. A brief pause. Dylan said to tell you the bike is running perfectly. Jake closed his eyes for half a second. Thank you, he said. He hung up and turned to Sandra Voss. We're going to need a few minutes, he said. Sandra Voss's expression moved in a direction that was not pleased. Mr. Harrison, the terms of the debt agreement specify. I just received legal counsel, Jake said. He was surprised by how steady his own voice was. I'm not signing anything until my attorney has reviewed the documentation you have provided. That's my legal right, and if you'd like to challenge it, you're welcome to wait while I make another call. He held her gaze. Would you like more coffee while you wait? It was possibly the most composed he had felt in months, maybe longer. Sandra Voss looked at Davis. Davis looked at his notepad and wrote something down. We'll wait, she said in the tone of someone who is very confident the wait won't matter. Jake got up and went to the filing cabinet in the corner. The same filing cabinet his father had used gray metal 4 drawers, the second drawer, sticking slightly because it always had. He pulled out the folder he'd labeled at Mercer Debt with the particular grim humor of a man who knows what folder he might need in a crisis. He took it to the small copier he kept for customer invoices and insurance forms, and he started scanning. Page by page, every notice, every letter, every demand with its escalating numbers and his legal language designed to overwhelm rather than clarify. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been all night. While he scanned, he heard Pete Galvez's voice from the main bay. Pete was talking to someone, multiple someones, and then Jake heard additional voices and he realized people were arriving. Frank DeLuca from the diner, unmistakable, because Frank had a voice that carried in any acoustic environment. Maria Sandoval, and others he couldn't identify. They weren't coming inside, they were in the parking lot. They weren't making noise or causing a scene. They were just there the way people are, sometimes just there when the moment requires it. Davis walked to the bay door at one point and looked out. When he came back to the office, he said something quietly to Sandra Voss. Voss's jaw tightened slightly. Jake kept scanning. At 9:22, Marcus Kane called back. I've got it, he said. The focused quality in his voice had sharpened into something harder and cleaner, the voice of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for. Mercer's firm acquired your debt through Consolidated Southwest Holdings on March 4th. Consolidated Southwest Holdings is a shell company Mercer created in 2021 specifically for debt acquisition. Under Arizona 6132, a debt transferred through a non-licensed acquisition entity to a secondary creditor requires disclosure to the debtor in a 45-day cure period before any foreclosure action can be initiated. A beat. You received no such disclosure and no cure period was offered. Jake stood very still in the middle of his office holding the phone, which means Marcus Kane said that this morning's foreclosure action is procedurally void. Not permanently, Mercer can refile if he corrects the disclosure failure, but he cannot complete a valid foreclosure today, not legally. How confident are you? Jake asked. Confident enough that I have already drafted the injunction filing, Marcus said. I need your authorization to file it in the next 20 minutes. Jake looked through the doorway into the main bay. He could see Pete Galvez standing near the workbench talking to Frank DeLuca. He could see the parking lot beyond where people had gathered, not many, maybe 8 or 10, standing in the morning sun, doing nothing except being present. He thought about Dylan Cross on a payphone outside of Wickenburg, covered in road dust, stopped for 10 minutes in a 4,500-mile journey to make one phone call on behalf of a man he'd known for 6 hours. He thought about Roy Briggs, who had said next summer for 20 years. He thought about Carol, who had always had a plan. File it, Jake said. The next 22 minutes were the longest of Jake Harrison's life, which was saying something given the night he'd had. Sandra Voss had stopped pretending to be patient. She and Davis were on their own phones now separately, and the quality of their conversations had shifted from routine to urgent. Jake couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the register, the particular frequency of professionals who have encountered an unexpected complication and are rapidly recalculating. Mercer arrived at 9:38. He came through the bay door without knocking, which was not something he had bothered to not do the first time either. But this time he didn't have the walk, the leverage walk, the money language walk. He walked with something that was edging toward controlled urgency, and he looked at Jake with eyes that had recalibrated. What did you file? He said. Jake looked at him from across the workbench where he'd stood all night. The workbench under the photograph of his father. My attorney filed, Jake said. On what grounds? You'd have to ask him. Mercer crossed to Sandra Voss. They spoke in short, fast words Jake could mostly hear, but wasn't focusing on because he was watching the bay door where Pete Galvez had appeared, and behind Pete Frank DeLuca, and behind Frank Maria Sandoval, and they were all looking at Jake with expressions that were entirely different from the expression Grant Mercer was currently wearing. At 9:51, Marcus Kane called for the third time. "Injunction granted," he said. "Emergency basis, Judge Patricia Morrow, Maricopa County Superior Court. Mercer's foreclosure action is stayed pending a full hearing." He paused. "You have got time, Jake. Not forever, but time." Jake set the phone down on the workbench. He stood there for a moment with his hand flat on the metal surface. The same workbench, the same hands, the same garage. That was still, for now, the same garage. "Well," Pete Galvez asked from the doorway. Jake looked up. He looked at Pete. He looked at Frank DeLuca's large and expectant face. He looked at Maria from the flower shop, who had her hands clasped together in front of her like she was waiting for a verdict. He looked at his father's photograph on the shelf above the coffee cans. "We got an injunction," Jake said. His voice was completely even. "Foreclosure is stayed." The sound that went through the small gathering was quiet and immediate. Not a cheer exactly, something more contained. The sound of people who understand that stayed doesn't mean won, but who know that stayed means today there is still something to fight for. Grant Mercer walked out of the office and through the bay and past all of them without making eye contact. Davis followed. Sandra Voss paused in the bay door and looked back at Jake, a long, measuring look that was not quite hostile and not quite respectful, but somewhere in between the look of a professional who has been surprised. Then she left too. The sound of their car leaving the lot seemed very loud in the quiet that followed. Frank DeLuca clasped Jake on the shoulder, hewing. Man's hand was enormous, the hand of someone who had lifted heavy things all his life. "What happens next?" he asked. "We go to court," Jake said. "You have a good lawyer." "I have a lawyer I met 40 minutes ago on the phone," Jake said. "Who was called by a man I met 6 hours ago who came in at midnight pushing a broken Harley." Frank DeLuca stared at him. "It's been a complicated morning," Jake said. Pete Galvez laughed, then actually laughed, the genuine kind, and it broke something in the room open in the best possible way. Maria laughed too. Tom Reeves, whom Jake hadn't even registered arriving, started laughing from somewhere near the tire rack. And Jake Harrison, who had not slept in 33 hours, who had spent the night machining steel and making coffee and talking to a stranger about grief in the Pacific Ocean and the particular weight of the things we owe the dead, who had sat in a metal folding chair at 7 in the morning and let himself feel completely what it would mean to lose this place. Jake Harrison smiled. Not a big smile, not a fixed-it smile, the quiet kind that means I'm still here, the kind Carol would have recognized. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number with a Phoenix area code. It said, "Jake, it's Marcus Kane. Good work today. There's more to do, but today was the right kind of start. Dylan said you'd understand what that means." Jake read it twice. Then he put the phone in his pocket, walked to the workbench, picked up a shop rag, and started wiping down his tools. Because the day wasn't over and Pete Galvez still needed his brakes done, and that was the next right thing. Behind him, the garage filled with the sounds of people who had shown up, conversation, coffee being poured. Frank DeLuca explaining something loudly to someone outside and under all of it. So familiar, Jake barely registered it separately from his own breathing, the particular smell of oil and rubber and old wood and time. Harrison's garage was still Harrison's garage. For now, and now was what he had. Pete Galvez's brakes took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Jake knew the exact time because he watched the clock the way a man watches a clock when the clock is the only thing keeping him anchored to the present instead of spinning out into everything that was still unresolved. The injunction had bought him time, not safety, not a solution. Time and time was a different thing entirely from winning a distinction Marcus Kane had been careful to make clear in his third call, and that Jake was careful not to forget. He worked on Pete's truck with the methodical focus of someone who understands that the antidote to panic is precision. Brake pads front and rear, fluid flush. He checked the rotor thickness while he was in there because Pete was 68 and drove mostly highway, and Jake had been checking Pete Galvez's rotor thickness since 2009 without being asked because that was the kind of mechanic Raymond Harrison had raised. Pete sat in the waiting area, 2 chairs and a coffee table with magazines from 2019 that nobody had ever replaced, and drank coffee and made occasional phone calls in a low voice and pretended not to be watching Jake, which Jake appreciated. The others had mostly gone. Frank DeLuca had to get back to his diner. Maria had a delivery at noon. Tom Reeves had a job across town. They had come when it mattered and left without making a production of leaving, which was exactly right. At 11:47, Emma Harrison arrived. Jake heard her car before he saw her, the particular sound of his daughter's 10-year-old Subaru with the exhaust that needed attention, a job he'd offered to do twice. And she declined twice because Emma was 31 years old and professionally competent and deeply allergic to accepting help from her father, even when the help was offered in the specific language of a man who needed to feel useful. She came through the bay door carrying a paper bag from a place that made breakfast burritos, and she stopped when she saw him, and he saw her, and neither of them said anything for a second. Emma Harrison looked like her mother, not in a way that was hard to see, in a way that was impossible not to see, impossible to look at directly for too long without something happening in the chest that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with love and loss existing in the same space simultaneously. "You're still here," she said. "I'm still here," Jake said. She crossed the garage in 6 steps and put her arms around him, and he held on, and it lasted exactly long enough for both of them to make sure the other was real. And then she stepped back and held up the paper bag and said, "Eat something before I lose my mind." He ate. It was the first food in 35 hours, and it hit him like a physical event. Like his body was reminding him that it existed and had requirements, regardless of what his mind was dealing with. Emma pulled the other stool to the workbench and sat beside him while he ate, and he told her everything: Dylan Cross, Roy Briggs, the midnight repair, the $52, the lawyers, Marcus Kane, the injunction. He told it straight through without editorializing because he was too tired to edit, and Emma deserved the unabridged version. She listened without interrupting, which was something she'd learned from her mother, and which Carol had learned from her own mother, and which Jake suspected was a gift that passed through women and families without anyone formally teaching it. When he finished, Emma was quiet for a moment. "A stranger on a payphone saved the garage," she said. "A stranger on a payphone who I fixed a bike for at midnight." Emma looked at him the way Carol used to look at him when he'd done something that required looking at. Not approval exactly, something more specific than that. Recognition. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Mom would have," she stopped. "I know," Jake said. They sat with us that for a moment at the unfinished sentence that didn't need finishing, the specific grammar of families who've lost someone whose presence is still more real than their absence. "What's the actual plan?" Emma asked, switching gears because she was Carol's daughter, and Carol's daughters didn't sit in feelings when there was work to do. "With Marcus Kane, what does the case look like? He thinks the violation is clear enough that Mercer might settle rather than go to full hearing. Avoid the exposure." Jake crumpled the burrito wrapper. "But he also said Mercer has beaten clearer violations than this in the past, so I shouldn't count on anything." "How much does Kane cost?" "He said he'd talk about that after the initial review." Emma pulled out her phone and started typing. "I'm looking him up." "Emma, I'm looking him up," said. She didn't look up from the phone. "If this man is going to be the reason we keep this building, I want to know who he is." Jake let her look, partly because she was right, and partly because having her there doing something purposeful was making it easier for him to breathe. "Marcus Kane," Emma read, "former Maricopa County assistant. DA private practice since 2014, specializes in consumer protection and predatory lending." She scrolled. "He's won 11 cases against debt acquisition firms in the last 6 years. A pause. "Dad, this man is not nobody." "Dylan knew who to call," Jake said. "How did Dylan Cross know Marcus Kane?" It was the question Jake hadn't asked yet, and Emma's asking it made him realize he should have asked it hours ago. He filed it away for later, for when he talked to Marcus again, which needed to happen today. There were documents to review, strategy to discuss, a hearing to prepare for. His phone buzzed on the workbench. Not Marcus Kane. Unknown number, different area code. He picked it up. "Jake Harrison," he said. "Mr. Harrison, my name is Robert Kane. I'm a reporter with the Arizona Republic." A practiced pause. "I'm writing a piece about Grant Mercer's debt acquisition operations along the Route 66 corridor. I've been working on it for 4 months. I heard about this morning's injunction, and I wondered if you'd be willing to speak with me." Jake looked at Emma. She was watching him with sharp eyes, already reading the situation from his expression. "How did you hear about the injunction?" Jake asked. "I have a source in the county clerk's office," Kane said. "Emergency filings are public record. Your name showed up, and I recognized the address. Harrison's Garage has been on my list of businesses to contact for a while now. Your list. There are 14 businesses along this stretch of highway that Mercer's companies have targeted in the last 4 years. Yours is the first to successfully obtain an injunction. That's significant. Another pause, more deliberate this time. Mr. Harrison, the story I'm writing is going to run whether or not you talk to me, but it will be more complete and more useful if you do. Jake was quiet for a moment. Let me call you back, he said. Of course, I'll leave my number. I have it, Jake said. You called me. He hung up. MMA was already leaning forward. Who was that? Reporter, Arizona Republic. Says Mercer's been targeting 14 businesses on this corridor. Emma sat back. Something moved across her face, the expression of a woman doing rapid calculations about consequences, about what going public means, about risk and exposure, and the particular vulnerability of people who are still in the middle of a legal fight. Then she said, that could be good or it could be very bad. I know. If Mercer feels cornered, I know. But if the story is already being written, Emma, Jake looked at her. I know, all of it. I need to talk to Marcus. He called Marcus Kane. Marcus picked up on the first ring, which Jake was beginning to understand was just how Marcus operated. I just got a call from a reporter at the Republic, Jake said. Robert Kane, he's writing about Mercer. A brief silence on Marcus's end that was not empty. It was the silence of a man who has just received information he was not expecting and is immediately integrating it. Kane's been on Mercer's trail for months. He came to me in February about another case, which is actually how I first built out the full picture of Mercer's operation. Another pause. This changes some things. Good changes or bad changes. Complicated changes. If Kane publishes before our hearing, Mercer may accelerate, try to settle quietly to avoid the press, or he may dig in and fight harder to make an example. I can't predict which way he'll go. Marcus's voice took on a decisive edge. What I can tell you is that you should not talk to Kane yet, not until after the preliminary hearing. At that point, speaking on record may work significantly in your favor. He said 14 businesses. At least 14. I've confirmed 11. The other 3 are still, Marcus stopped. Then carefully, Jake, there's something else I've been reviewing in your documentation that I need to talk to you about. The shift in his tone was subtle, but Jake caught it. The way a man's voice changes when he's been carrying something and has decided it's time to put it down between you. What? Jake said. The original debt. The medical debt from Carol's treatment. A beat. Who was your original creditor before Mercer acquired it? Jake felt his jaw tighten. Southwest Medical Financial Services. I know that company, Marcus said. I know it very well. Southwest Medical Financial Services has a settlement relationship with Coronado Health Systems, which is the hospital network that handled Carol's treatment. He paused. The billing errors in medical debt of this size and complexity in that system are, Jake, I want to be careful how I say this, not uncommon, and often not accidental. The workbench, Jake's hands flat on the workbench. Are you telling me the original $60,000 might not have been accurate? Jake asked. I'm telling you I want my associate to review every bill from Carol's treatment before our hearing, Marcus said. Can you get me those documents? Jake stared at nothing. 34 months of bills, EOBs, insurance correspondence, billing disputes, the entire paper record of 8 months of fighting for Carol's life, which he had kept in a box in the office because he hadn't been able to throw it away and hadn't been able to look at it again either. The box that sat in the bottom cabinet under the desk that had been his father's desk behind a stack of old invoices, precisely because there it was close but not visible. I have them, he said. I need them today. I'll scan everything. Jake, Marcus's voice went quieter. I know what it means to dig back into those records. I want you to know that I understand what I'm asking. Jake breathed. I'll have them to you by 4. He hung up. Emma had heard enough to understand. She said nothing. She just looked at her father for a moment, and then she said, I'll help you scan. They spent 90 minutes in the office going through the box. Jake had organized it when he put it there. Carol would have expected organization. So the bills were in chronological order by date of service, then insurance correspondence, then the disputes, then the final summary statements. Emma ran the scanner. Jake checked each document before she scanned it to make sure the relevant information was visible. He had trained himself not to read them when he'd first put them in the box. He applied the same discipline now. Each page was a record of something that had been fought for and ultimately lost, and he was a mechanic, not a masochist. He looked at the billing numbers, the codes, the dates, the totals. He did not look at the treatment notes or the physician comments or anything that would turn these pages from financial documents back into the story of Carol's last 8 months. Except once. One page of billing summary from March of 2 years ago when Carol had been in her 5th month of treatment, and they'd still believed in the statistics, still believed she would be in the percentage that made it. This page had Carol's handwriting in the margin. Small, neat, her particular handwriting that had always looked more deliberate than most people's, like she considered each letter worth making properly. She'd written, "Ask Jake to check this. $4,400 difference on line 14. She had been fighting the billing from her hospital bed. Jake stood with that page in his hand for longer than he should have. Emma glanced at him and saw what was in his hand and said nothing, just kept the scanner going, giving him the space a daughter gives a father when the space is the only useful thing she has to offer. He put the page face down on the scanner without looking at the numbers. The number didn't matter right now. Marcus Kane's associate would look at the numbers. Right now, what mattered was getting through the next minutes and the next after that. By 2:15, everything was scanned and emailed. Jake closed the box and put it back in the bottom cabinet. He sat in his father's chair for a moment with his hands on his knees. His phone rang. This time the number was one he recognized, a local number, a 928 area code, someone from the area. He picked up. Harrison's. Jake, a man's voice rough and familiar. Hector Vega, who ran the transmission shop 4 miles down the road, who Jake had known since they were both apprentices in other men's garages 25 years ago. "I heard what happened this morning." "News travels fast," Jake said. "Pete Galvez called Frank DeLuca, and Frank called me, and I've already talked to 9 other people on this strip." Hector's voice had an energy in it that Jake recognized, not excitement, exactly more like the particular aliveness that comes into people when they feel like something is happening that they're supposed to be part of. "Jake, listen to me. There are a lot of people along this highway who have been waiting for someone to push back on Mercer. You understand, not just complaining about him waiting, for someone to actually do something that works." Jake said nothing. "There's going to be a meeting tonight," Hector said, "at Frank's Diner, 7 o'clock. Business owners from this whole section of the corridor, people who've been hit by Mercer or who know someone who has." A pause. "We want you there." "Hector, I'm not a community organizer. I'm a mechanic in the middle of a legal fight." "That's exactly why we want you there," Hector said. "Because you didn't give a speech. You didn't organize anything. You just refused to sign. And then your lawyer found the hole." That's the story people are responding to Jake. Not a hero, just a man who held on long enough for the right thing to happen. A beat. 7 o'clock, Frank's Diner. Say yes. Jake looked at Emma through the office window. She was wiping down the workbench with a shop rag she'd found somewhere, cleaning a space that wasn't hers to clean, just doing it because it was there and needed doing. 7 o'clock, Jake said. He arrived at Frank DeLuca's diner at 6:52 with Emma beside him and Pete Galvez pulling in behind them, which Pete had apparently decided to do without asking anyone's permission, because Pete Galvez had established early in this particular day that he was not the kind of man who waited to be invited to things that mattered. The diner had been closed to regular customers for the evening. Frank had put on coffee, 2 industrial carafes, and arranged the tables into a rough rectangle so people could see each other. There were 17 people when Jake walked in. By 7:10, there were 23. Jake recognized most of them. Faces from years of community, from the particular social geography of a small corridor town where everyone knows what the others are dealing with because the same forces are dealing with all of them. He saw weariness in some of those faces. He saw anger in others. He saw the particular expression that people wear when they have been afraid and are starting to wonder if the fear was the right response. Marcus Kane was there. Jake hadn't expected that. Marcus Kane was a man in his early 60s, compact and deliberate in the way of someone who has spent decades choosing his words and his movements carefully. He'd driven from Phoenix. He was standing near the coffee, talking quietly to a woman Jake didn't recognize. Jake went to him. You came, Jake said. Seemed important, Marcus said simply. He gestured to the woman beside him. This is Diane Ruiz. She's a former Arizona banking regulator. She's been building a parallel case against Mercer's acquisition practices for the state AG's office. Jake looked at Diane Ruiz. She was in her mid-50s, dark-haired, with the direct eyes of someone who has spent a career looking at systems and finding where they break. She extended her hand. Mr. Harrison, she said, your injunction this morning was helpful to us. How? Because it created a public record of Mercer using Consolidated Southwest Holdings. She said, we've been trying to formally connect Mercer to that entity for 6 months. Your filing does it in county court record. She held his gaze. The AG's office is considering whether to intervene. Jake stood very still. Intervene, he said, as in the state of Arizona joining your case as a co-plaintiff, Marcus said, and simultaneously opening an investigation into Mercer's entire acquisition operation. He said it evenly, the way a man delivers information that is significant without wanting to oversell it. It's not certain, but it's possible. The room had filled behind them while they talked. Frank called for everyone's attention, and people found chairs or stood along the walls, and the meeting began, 23 people talking about what had been done to them and what it had cost and what, if anything, could be done about it now. Jake listened more than he spoke. That was his instinct. But when Frank turned to him and said, Jake, tell them what happened with Marcus. He told it, clean and factual, the way his father had told stories. Say what happened in order without decoration and let the facts carry the weight. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. A woman named Gloria Reyes, who ran a roadside craft gallery that Mercer's people had been threatening for 2 years, said, you fixed a stranger's motorcycle for $52 at midnight. And that's what started this. That's what started it, Jake said. Gloria Reyes shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, in the particular wonder of someone encountering a fact that refuses to be reduced to something manageable. I've been afraid of Mercer for 2 years, she said. 2 years I've been paying whatever he asks, adjusting whatever he demands, because I was afraid if I pushed back, he'd take everything, and I'd lose the gallery my mother started. She looked around the room. I don't want to be afraid anymore. The murmur that went around the room at that was not theatrical. It was the sound of 17 other people recognizing something they'd felt individually and were now feeling collectively. And the difference between those two versions of the same feeling is the difference between a problem and a movement. Marcus Kane spoke for 20 minutes about the legal landscape, what was realistic, what wasn't, what the AG intervention could mean, and what it couldn't guarantee. He didn't promise anything. That was the right call. People in this room had been promised things before, and the promises had been expensive. Diane Ruiz explained what the state investigation would need: documentation, testimony, the kind of paper trail that accumulates when businesses keep records of what's been done to them. 2 people immediately said they had boxes of documents at home. 3 more said they'd kept everything on principle, not knowing if it would ever matter. It mattered now. At 8:45, Marcus pulled Jake aside near the coffee station. There's something I've been meaning to ask you all day, Marcus said, and I've been putting it off because there's always been something more urgent. He looked at Jake directly. How did Dylan Cross know to call me specifically? Jake looked back at him. I was going to ask you the same thing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Dylan Cross came to me 3 years ago, he said. Different matter, nothing related to you or this property. He needed help with an estate issue involving Roy Briggs. Roy had no family, and Dylan was trying to ensure the estate was handled properly. A pause. We spent 2 days working through it together. He's a careful man, detail-oriented, the kind of man who files things away and remembers what might be useful and to whom. He remembered you, Jake said. Apparently, Marcus said, and from a payphone in Wickenburg without missing a beat, he put it together: what was happening to you, what I know about Mercer, and the fact that time was the critical variable. He paused. Jake, Dylan Cross made 1 phone call, 1, and that phone call is why you still have a garage tonight. Jake thought about that, about a man he'd known for 6 hours on a motorcycle in the Arizona desert, stopping at a payphone because a man named Roy Briggs never made it to the Pacific Ocean. And because of that, Dylan Cross understood something about the debts we owe and the cost of letting time run out. How's he doing? Jake asked. Do you know? I had a text around noon, Marcus said. He was through Blythe, said the bike was running clean. A pause. He'll make it, Jake nodded. He looked around Frank DeLuca's diner at 23 people who had been afraid and were choosing differently now. At Pete Galvesavia, refilling his coffee cup with the air of a man who had exactly nowhere else he needed to be. At his daughter Emma sitting across from Gloria Reyes and listening to her with the same expression Carol used to have when someone was telling her something that mattered. His phone buzzed. Marcus Kane's associate, a text preliminary review of Harrison medical billing complete, found $11,400 in billing irregularities. Calling you tomorrow and M. $11,400. Jake read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket. He stood there for a moment in the middle of a room full of people who had come together because one man fixed a motorcycle at midnight, and another man made a phone call at a payphone, and a third man filed an injunction, and a fourth man arranged a meeting, and the whole thing built on itself the way things build when the first piece is solid. Carol had written in the margin of a billing statement, "Ask Jake to check this. $4,400 difference on line 14. She'd been right. She'd always been right. And she had fought the billing from her hospital bed because she was Carol Harrison. And she did not accept numbers that didn't add up, not even at the end. Jake was going to fight it too. With Marcus Kane and Diane Ruiz in the AG's office, in the documented testimony of 23 business owners along Route 66 and everything his father and grandfather had built, and everything Carol had insisted was worth fighting for. But not tonight. Tonight was for being in this room with these people in this place that still bore his family's name. He went and got a cup of coffee, and he sat down next to Pete Galvez, and he listened to the room. Jake Harrison slept 4 hours and 11 minutes. He knew the exact number because he'd looked at the clock when Emma made him go lie down on the cot in the back office at 10:15. The same cot that had been there since his father's time, used it for the same reason the fathers and sons have always kept cots in their workplaces, which is that sometimes the work or the worry doesn't leave room for going home. And he looked at the clock again when his eyes opened at 2:26 in the morning, and he was completely immediately awake, in the way that people are awake when their nervous system has decided that sleep has provided what it can, and the rest is up to the waking mind. 4 hours and 11 minutes. It was the most he'd slept in 3 days, and it was enough. Not comfortable, not restorative in the way that 7 or 8 hours would have been, but enough to function, which was all he was asking. He sat on the edge of the cot in the dark and listened to the garage around him. The building made sounds at night, the same sounds it had always made, the small contractions and settlements of a structure that had been standing in Arizona heat for 60-plus years. He'd grown up hearing those sounds. As a kid, he'd thought the garage talked to itself after hours working through the day's events in its own private language. He still thought that in the way adults maintain the things they believed as children, that turned out to be more true than false. He got up, made coffee, and sat at his father's desk with the documents Marcus Kane's associate had flagged in Carol's billing records spread in front of him. $11,400 in billing irregularities. The associate, a young woman named Priya, who had a voice that was precise in the way of someone who had learned to be careful about every word she said professionally, had walked him through it on the phone for 40 minutes the previous evening. Duplicate charges billed under different procedure codes. A 3-day ICU rate billed for a period when Carol had been moved to a standard room. Jake could prove that because he had been there every day, and he had the visitor logs and the nursing notes that Carol had insisted on getting copies of because Carol Harrison did not trust systems she couldn't verify. A medication charge for a drug that Carol's own oncologist had documented as contraindicated for her specific case and therefore never administered. Someone had billed them for a drug Carol never received. Jake sat with that one for a long moment. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an investigator. He was a mechanic who understood systems, mechanical systems, hydraulic systems, the systems that make things run or make things fail. And what he was looking at in these billing records was a system that had failed deliberately, which was a different and worse thing than a system that failed by accident. He wrote notes in the margin of the flagged pages. Not because Marcus Kane needed his notes, Marcus and Priya were more than capable of building the legal argument. He wrote them because Carol had written in the margin of her billing statement, and he understood now fully that this was something she'd been fighting, something she'd intended to continue fighting, and he was finishing it for her. That was not sentimental. That was accurate. At 4:15, his phone rang. The screen said Marcus Kane. "You're up early," Jake said. "I'm still up," Marcus said. "I've been working through the Consolidated Southwest Holdings Incorporation documents." "Jake, there's a second entity." His voice had the controlled precision of a man who has been awake all night finding things. "Mercer has a second shell company, Horizon Corridor Assets, LLC, that he's been using for the properties where Consolidated Southwest has too much exposure. 3 of the 14 businesses on Kane's list were acquired through Horizon Corridor, not Consolidated Southwest. Different entity, same pattern, same violation of 6-132, but it means we're dealing with a deliberate structural split to limit liability." Jake processed this. "He built 2 shells, so if one got caught, the other stays clean," Marcus said. "Exactly. He's been doing this for at least 6 years. The incorporation date on Horizon Corridor is 2018. A pause. "Diane Ruiz at the AG's office needs to know about this today. And I mean early today. She's making her recommendation to the AG at 9 this morning about whether to intervene." "Call her," Jake said. "I'm calling her at 6. I wanted you to know first." A brief silence. "There's something else. Robert Kane from the Republic called me last night." Jake straightened in the chair. "He's been sitting on the story for 4 months waiting for a legal action he could anchor it to," Marcus said. "Your injunction gave him the anchor. He's planning to publish Thursday. What does that mean for us?" "It means Mercer is going to know the story is coming. He may already know Kane extended him a comment request last night." Marcus's voice became very deliberate. "Jake, when Mercer knows the story is coming, he will make a move. I don't know what that move looks like yet, but we need to be prepared for him to accelerate. He may file a counter motion. He may try to contact you directly, go around me, offer something that sounds like resolution, but creates a complication. If he contacts me, you say call my attorney. Nothing else. 3 words. Call my attorney," Jake repeated. "Don't engage beyond that. Not even to be polite. Mercer is a man who uses politeness as a lever." Marcus paused. "Get some sleep if you can." "Already tried." "Try again." Jake didn't try again. He sat at the desk until 5:30, then went into the main bay and started working on a car that had been waiting since Monday, a 1994 Chevy Blazer belonging to a woman named Rosa Contreras, who worked double shifts at the hospital and needed her vehicle and had been patient about it longer than she should have had to be. He worked by habit and by feel, and by the particular competence of a man who has been doing something long enough that his hands carry the knowledge independently of whatever his mind is occupied with. His mind was occupied with billing codes and shell companies and a reporter named Kane writing a story that would go out Thursday, and whatever Grant Mercer was going to do to him when he read his own name in it. At 6:50, Emma arrived. She had gone back to Pete Galvez's house. Pete had offered, which was typical Pete, and she came in carrying 2 coffees from the gas station down the road and wearing the expression of someone who had slept adequately and was ready to work. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Make sure the documentation for Marcus is organized," Jake said. "Everything we scanned yesterday, the billing records, my original loan documents, the correspondence from Mercer's firm, going back to the first letter. Done by 8. Done by 8. Emma put the coffee on the workbench and went to the office. The sound of her at the computer was in its own way one of the most comforting sounds Jake had heard in a long time. Not because he needed her to do it, he was capable of organizing his own documents, but because she was there doing it, which meant he wasn't alone in the particular way that had been the hardest thing about the last 14 months. Not the practical aloneness, the specific aloneness of carrying things that are too heavy and having no one to set them down with. At 7:44, Marcus Kane called again. This time he was speaking faster, not urgently, but with the compressed energy of a man whose timeline has shifted. "Diane Ruiz called me at 7:15, he said. "The AG's office is in. They're formally intervening. The filing goes in at 9 this morning." A beat. "Jake, do you understand what that means?" Jake understood it abstractly from the meeting at Frank's Diner. He wanted Marcus to say it plainly. "Tell me." "It means this is no longer Jake Harrison versus Grant Mercer," Marcus said. "It means the state of Arizona is standing next to you in court. It means Mercer's entire operation, both shell companies, all 14 businesses, 6 years of acquisition history, is now under state investigation. His attorneys won't be fighting a mechanic with an injunction. They'll be fighting the Arizona Attorney General. A pause that had weight. It also means this is going to become very public, very fast. Are you ready for that? Jake looked around his garage, at the shelves his grandfather built, at the clock on the wall, at the framed photograph of his father shaking hands with a man on a motorcycle in New Mexico in 1974. I was ready when I didn't sign the papers, he said. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. That's the right answer. I'll call you after the filing. He stopped. One more thing. Dylan Cross sent me a message this morning. He reached Malibu last night. Jake closed his eyes. He found a beach access point that's open early, Marcus continued. He and Roy watched the sunrise over the Pacific. A brief pause. He said to tell you Roy made it. Jake opened his eyes. He looked at his father's photograph. He looked at the old coffee can of spare bolts on the second shelf from the left. Good, he said. His voice was completely even. Good. At 8:53, 7 minutes before the AG's office filed its intervention, Grant Mercer called Jake's personal cell. Jake looked at the number. He knew it. He'd seen it on enough correspondence. He let it ring twice, 3 times. He thought about what Marcus had said. 3 words. He picked up. Call my attorney, he said and hung up. Mercer called back 40 seconds later. Jake didn't answer. He put his phone face down on the workbench and kept working on Rosa Contreras' blazer. At 9:08, the phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize, Phoenix area code. He picked up. Mr. Harrison, a man's voice different from Mercer's, smooth in the professional way. My name is Vincent Holloway. I represent Mr. Mercer in his business operations. I'm calling because I believe there may be a misunderstanding about the nature of... Call my attorney, Jake said and hung up. Emma appeared in the doorway to the office. Who was that? Mercer's lawyer, different one. He looked at her. They're calling direct because Marcus filed something and they're trying to get around him. Are you going to tell Marcus? Already texting him. Marcus replied in under 90 seconds, expected. Document every call time, number, name if given. Speak to no one. Good work. At 10:15, Robert Kane from the Arizona Republic arrived in person. Jake had not invited him, but he'd also not told him not to come, and in the absence of prohibition, Kane had apparently made the reasonable journalistic calculation that showing up was better than waiting. He was younger than Jake had imagined from the phone call, early 40s, unshaven in the way of someone who'd been working late with the recorder and a notebook, and the particular self-possession of a person who has sat across from difficult people in difficult situations often enough that he's found a way to be calm in them. He stood at the bay door entrance. The way Dylan Cross had stood there, Jake noticed, not assuming entry, waiting to be acknowledged. Mr. Harrison, Kane said, I know your attorney asked you not to talk to me yet. I'm not here for a statement. I'm here because I think you should know what's in the story before it runs. He held up the notebook. Nothing I show you changes what I'm publishing, but I believe in giving people the opportunity to understand what's about to happen to their lives. Jake looked at him for a long moment. He called Marcus. Kane's here, he said, in person. He says he wants to show me the story before it runs, not get a statement. A brief pause. That's actually ethical practice. Let him show you. Don't comment on anything. Don't correct anything. Don't confirm or deny. Just read it and let him leave. And if there's something wrong in it, then I'll call Kane after for attorney to attorney. But Jake, if Kane's been working this story for 4 months and he's as good as I think he is, there won't be much wrong in it. Jake hung up and looked at Kane. Come in, he said. Kane came in. He didn't look around the garage the way people usually look around spaces with interest or judgment, or the particular assessment of an outsider evaluating what a place says about its owner. He went straight to the workbench, set down his notebook, and pulled out printed pages. The headline, he said, setting the first page in front of Jake, is Predator on the Highway, How Grant Mercer Has Systematically Stripped Route 66 Businesses Using Illegal Debt Acquisition. Jake read. He read all of it, standing at his workbench with his hands at his sides, not touching the pages. It was 12 pages of reported journalism. It had names, 14 business owners, 11 of whom had agreed to be identified, 3 who were anonymous. It had documents and corporation records for Consolidated Southwest Holdings, and Jake saw with a small shock Horizon Corridor Assets, LLC, which meant Kane had found the second entity independently without Marcus's help, which said something about how long and how carefully this man had been working. It had Jake's name. Not prominently, he was introduced late in the story as the mechanic whose injunction had triggered the AG investigation, but his name was there, and his garage was there, and the injunction was there. And near the end, in a section about what had enabled the injunction to happen at all, there was a paragraph that stopped Jake cold. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Kane. "Where did you get this?" Jake asked. Kane looked at where Jake's finger was resting on the page. "Which part?" "The part about the motorcycle." Kane's expression shifted into something that was professionally neutral, but had underneath it the quality of a man who has genuinely been moved by a piece of information. "Dylan Cross called me," he said. "Yesterday afternoon he was in Malibu." A pause. "He wanted to make sure the story included what actually started this. He said," Kane looked at his notebook. "He said the injunction matters. The law matters. But a man fixed a stranger's bike in the middle of his worst night for $52 and a dead man's last trip to the ocean, and that's the reason any of the rest of it happened. That's the story inside the story." Kane closed the notebook. I agreed with him. Jake stood at the workbench and looked at the page and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate. "It's good work," he finally said. "About the story. He meant it." "Thank you," Kane said. He gathered the pages. "Thursday morning online at 6 print edition by noon." He paused at the bay door. "Mr. Harrison, for what it's worth, I've been working on stories about people like Mercer for 12 years. I've seen what he does to people. What you did, holding the line, getting the injunction, it matters beyond your own situation." "I know," Jake said. After Kane left, Emma came out of the office. She'd heard most of it. "The motorcycle is in the story," she said. "Yeah. Dylan called a reporter from Malibu." "Yeah." Emma sat on the stool. She was quiet for a moment, then, "He really made sure, didn't he? He made sure it all held together. The lawyer, the story, everything." She looked at her father. "He came in with a broken bike and $52, and he made sure." Jake nodded. "Why?" Emma asked, not rhetorically, actually asking. Jake thought about what Dylan had said in the garage at 3 in the morning, standing in the oil and rubber air with a cup of coffee in his hands. About Roy, about next summer becoming no more summers, about the particular cost of letting time run out on the things that should be done. "Because Roy didn't get there in time," Jake said. And Dylan decided that meant something. That every time you have the chance to do the right thing, you do it because time isn't something you can count on having more of. Emma was quiet for a long time. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her expression had changed. "Dad, she said. Something in her voice made him stop. "What?" She turned the phone so he could see the screen. It was a local news alert, not the Republic, a local Kingman station. The headline read, "Breaking Arizona. AG opens investigation into Route 66 debt acquisitions. Names Grant Mercer." The story had broken 6 hours before Kane's piece was supposed to run. Someone at the AG's office had talked, or Mercer's attorneys had filed a response that became public record. Either way, it was out now. Jake's phone started ringing, then Emma's, then the shop phone on the desk. He looked at all three of them ringing simultaneously. This man who had spent the last 36 hours moving from crisis to crisis with barely a breath between them, and something happened in his expression that Emma would describe later to a friend as the look of a man who has been standing in surf for a long time and suddenly realized the tide has shifted. He picked up his cell. It was Marcus. "The AG filing went public," Marcus said. "Mercer's attorneys filed a response at 11 this morning, which made the intervention a public record. It's running on local TV now." His voice was controlled but fast. "Mercer's PR people are going to push a narrative that this is government overreach, that he's a legitimate businessman being targeted. You're going to get calls from media. Don't take them. Send everything to me." "Already ringing," Jake said. "Let it ring." A pause. "Jake, this is actually the right development, even though it feels chaotic. The more public it is before the hearing, the more expensive it becomes for Mercer to fight. He has business relationships, investors, a reputation in Phoenix that matters to him commercially. Public pressure is not a legal argument, but it is a real force." Another pause. "Are you okay?" Jake looked at the garage, at Emma managing both phones simultaneously writing numbers on a notepad, at the clock on the wall, at his father's photograph. "I'm okay," he said, and he meant it, which surprised him a little. By 2 in the afternoon, 3 local TV news vans had parked on the Route 66 shoulder outside the garage. Jake did not go outside to speak to them. He let Marcus's statement, a 4-paragraph document that was precise and clean, and said exactly as much as was strategically useful, and no more stand as the official word. But at 2:45, Hector Vega called. "Yeah, Jake." Hector's voice was different from how it had been at Frank's diner. Not the organized meeting voice. The other voice, the one from the transmission shop at the end of the day, the voice of a man talking to someone he's known for 25 years. "Something's happening." "What kind of something?" "People are coming," Hector said. "Not to the garage specifically, or not only to the garage. They're coming to the quarter. I've been getting calls since noon. Bikers mostly, but not just bikers." A pause. "Jake, I don't fully understand what's happening, but I think you should know." Jake stood very still. "Bikers from where?" "Everywhere," Hector said. "That's what I'm saying. From Flagstaff, from Albuquerque, from Las Vegas. Someone told me there are people coming from California." His voice had a quality to it that Jake had never heard from Hector before, which was a kind of bewildered awe. "I think it's got something to do with Dylan Cross, something to do with the community he belongs to. Word got around about what happened here and—" Hector stopped. "Jake, someone just told me there are 100 bikes coming up the highway." Jake's hand tightened on the phone. 100, he said. At least Hector said. "They'll be here by 4. Jake stood in the middle of Harrison's garage at 2:53 in the afternoon and tried to understand what he was being told. He had been awake for the better part of 2 days. He had fought off a foreclosure triggered an AG investigation, had his story written into a newspaper, watched his dead wife's billing records become evidence, and somehow in the middle of all of it, a dead man named Roy Briggs had ridden to the Pacific Ocean on a Harley that Jake had rebuilt with his own hands in the dark. And now 100 motorcycles were coming up Route 66. He called Marcus. "I know," Marcus said before Jake finished explaining. "Dylan Cross is connected to a network that goes way beyond this part of Arizona. I've been getting calls from people I don't know who know what happened here." A pause. "Jake, I want to be clear, this was not organized by anyone in our camp. This is organic. This is people who heard a story and decided it meant something to them." "What do I do?" Jake asked. "Nothing," Marcus said. "You stand there and let it happen, that's all." Emma had heard. She was standing in the office doorway with her hand over her mouth and an expression on her face that was trying to contain more than one large emotion simultaneously. Jake looked at Pete Galvez, who had somehow ended up back at the garage again in the early afternoon, which Jake had stopped questioning because Pete Galvez apparently considered Harrison's garage his second workplace now. "You heard?" Jake asked. Pete looked at him with the precise eyes of a 68-year-old man who has lived long enough to know which moments are the ones you hold on to. "I heard," Pete said. "Stay," Jake said. "I wasn't going anywhere," Pete said. They came at 4:17. Jake heard them before anything else, not just the sound of engines, but the particular massed sound of many engines in formation. The kind of sound that has its own register, its own frequency, that you feel in the chest as much as hear with the ears. It started as something far away and grew not quickly but steadily, the way a tide comes in, inevitable and large. He walked to the bay door and stood there. 107 motorcycles, someone counted afterward, rode in formation along Route 66 and turned into the corner in front of Harrison's garage and the surrounding businesses and did not stop. They rode slowly, deliberately in a formation that stretched the length of the block. Harleys and Indians and a few Hondas in one extraordinary vintage Triumph that had to be 40 years old and was running perfectly. Riders of every age and description, men and women gray-haired and young, leather-jacketed and helmeted, and wearing the particular dignity of people who have come somewhere on purpose and know why. They didn't honk. They didn't shout. They rode in formation and they rode slowly, and they looked at the garage, at Harrison's garage, at the name his grandfather had painted above the door in 1959. And that still read Harrison's because Grant Mercer had not gotten it yet, and Jake was beginning to believe was not going to get it, and their silence was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have chosen to say it this way, with their presence, with their machines, with the particular statement made by 100 human beings who drove from wherever they were to be on this road at this moment. Jake stood in his bay door. Pete Galvez stood beside him. Emma stood on his other side. She found his hand and held it, which she hadn't done since she was small, and he held on. Frank DeLuca was there, he'd heard, and closed the diner and walked down. Maria Sandoval, Hector Vega, Tom Reeves, Gloria Reyes, who had been afraid of Grant Mercer for 2 years and had said last night that she didn't want to be afraid anymore. A dozen people from the corridor community who had come because the moment required it, and they understood that requirement. The formation came around a second time. On the second pass near the front of the formation, Jake saw a familiar face. Dylan Cross. He was riding the Road King Roy's Harley, and he had come back from Malibu. He had put Roy's ashes in the Pacific Ocean at sunrise, and then he had turned the motorcycle around, and he had ridden east back through California and into Arizona, and he was here. He was leading the formation, or close to the front of it, the matte gray canister now absent from the saddlebag, because Roy was home finally in the water he'd never reached in life. Dylan Cross looked at Jake Harrison as he rode past, and he did not smile, and he did not wave, and he did not make any gesture that could be called theatrical, because Dylan Cross was not a theatrical man. He looked at Jake with those creek water eyes, and he nodded once. Jake nodded back. That was all. That was everything. The formation completed its second pass, and the riders began to pull into the lot of the closed motel across the road, filling it completely. Bikes parked in rows with the practiced efficiency of people who do this together regularly. They got off their machines and stood around talking quietly, eating, drinking from water bottles. The natural activity of people who have ridden a long way and arrived where they meant to arrive. Marcus Kane appeared at Jake's shoulder. He had driven from Phoenix and arrived somewhere in the middle of the formation. "This is going to be in Kane's story," Marcus said quietly. "He knows?" Jake asked. "Someone called him." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Jake, Mercer's attorneys called me 40 minutes ago. He wants to negotiate." Jake looked at him. "Full negotiation," Marcus said. "Not a settlement on your individual case. He wants to discuss a broader resolution before the story runs Thursday." He paused. He saw the formation. Someone sent him photographs in real time. "What does broader resolution mean?" Jake asked. "It means he knows the AG investigation is going to expose everything," Marcus said. "He knows the story is running Thursday. He knows that 100 motorcycles riding in support of a mechanic on Route 66 is a visual that's going to travel. And he's calculating the way men like Mercer always calculate what costs more fighting or settling." He looked at Jake. "I told his attorneys I'd convey the message. I didn't agree to anything. This is your decision." Jake looked at the lot across the road, at 107 riders who had come from everywhere because a story about a man who fixed a bike at midnight had traveled through their community and meant something to them. He looked at Emma, who was talking to Dylan Cross. Dylan had crossed the road, and Emma had introduced herself, and they were talking with the ease of people who already know each other through the person they both care about. He looked at Gloria Reyes, standing near her car, with her phone to her ear, calling someone, her voice animated and her posture entirely different from the posture she'd had at Frank's diner last night when she talked about being afraid. He looked at his father's garage. "Tell Mercer's attorneys," Jake said, "that any negotiation has to include all 14 businesses, not just mine, all of them, and the billing fraud from the medical debt has to be part of it." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "That significantly complicates the negotiation." "I know." "He may walk away from the table." "Then he walks away," Jake said, "and we go to the hearing, and the AG does what the AG is going to do, and Kane's story runs Thursday." Marcus Kane studied him with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in law, evaluating the character of the people he goes to court for. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have said exactly the same thing." Jake looked at him. "You didn't know my grandfather." "No," Marcus said, "but Dylan Cross told me about him." A pause. "He told me a lot about you actually in that 10-minute payphone call. I think Dylan Cross sized you up in 6 hours better than most people manage in a lifetime." Jake didn't have a response to that. He looked at Dylan Cross across the road, who was listening to Emma with his full attention. This man who had arrived broken at midnight and had left at dawn and had come back, who had made the calls and told the story and brought the people who had stood at the bay door with $52 in a dead man's last wish, and turned everything that came after into something different from what it would have been. Marcus went to call Mercer's attorneys. Emma caught Jake's eye across the road and raised her eyebrows in the universal daughter expression of, "Are you okay?" And he nodded in the universal father expression of, "I'm okay." That only works between people who know each other well enough to tell when it's true. At 6:30, Robert Kane arrived with a photographer. He wasn't subtle about it. He walked up to Jake and said, "I know you're not giving statements. I just want to photograph the garage, you if you're willing, the people here." He looked around the lot at the assembled riders. "This is the story, Mr. Harrison, you understand that?" "The story was a man with $52, Jake said. "The story is what a man with $52 started," Kane said. He wasn't wrong. Jake looked at NYE for a moment. "Timon, one photograph," and he said, "in front of the garage, me and my daughter, that's it." Kane nodded, didn't push for more. They stood in front of the Harrison's garage sign, Jake in his coveralls, Emma beside him with her hand through his arm, and Kane's photographer took the picture. It was simple and it was real, and Jake didn't try to arrange his face into anything. It wasn't because his face, after 36 hours of everything, was the most honest version of his face, and that was the version the picture should have. Dylan Cross appeared at his elbow when it was done. They hadn't spoken yet, not since the bay door at dawn. Dylan stood beside Jake and looked at the garage and the name above the door and the people in the lot across the road. He had the road on him, the accumulated miles of California and desert visible in the set of his posture, the lines around his eyes, the specific tiredness of a man who has ridden very far and very hard for a reason that mattered and has now completed the thing. "You came back," Jake said. "Couldn't go home without knowing how it ended," Dylan said. "It hasn't ended." "No," Dylan agreed, "but it's going to end right." He said it the way he said most things, not as a prediction, exactly more as an assessment by a man who has been around long enough to know the difference between a situation that is going to go wrong and one that is going to go right, and this was the latter. "Roy would have liked you," he added. Jake thought about Roy Briggs, about a man from Kansas who wanted to see the ocean and put it off for 20 years because there was always something, about the weight of that and about what Dylan Cross had done about it. "Did it help?" Jake asked. "Putting him there." Dylan was quiet for a long moment. In the lot across the road, someone had started a conversation that had become general laughter. The sound of it came over in waves. "It helped me," Dylan said finally. "Whether it helped Roy," he paused. "I think Roy would have said you made the ride. That's the point. The destination is where the ride ends. The ride is the thing." He looked at Jake. "You understand that?" Jake understood it. He had understood it since 4 in the morning when he was machining a reinforcement plate by hand for a man he'd known for 40 minutes, fueled by something he couldn't have named at the time and could only name now with some approximation. The understanding that some things are worth doing in full, without holding back even when you're exhausted and you're losing everything, and there's nothing in it for you because the doing of them fully is the only version of yourself you can live with afterward. "What happens to you now?" Jake asked. Dylan considered. "I go home," he said. "Get some rest. Let the bike rest." He looked at the Road King. "Come spring, I think I do the ride again." "The whole thing. Wichita to Malibu, same route Roy would have taken." He paused. "Maybe I bring some people. Make a thing of it. A memorial ride." "Or just a ride," Dylan said. Roy never made it about memorials. He just wanted to go. He looked at Jake. "Come spring, you could close the shop for a week." Jake stared at him. "Think about it," Dylan said. He wasn't joking. He also wasn't pushing. He was offering the way he'd offered the $52 fully without embarrassment, with the understanding that the other person had the right to say no. Jake thought about Carol, about Sedona and the Grand Canyon Rim at sunrise, and all the things he'd said next year too. About Roy Briggs saying next summer for 2 decades. "I'll think about it," he said. Dylan Cross nodded once, satisfied. The sun was going down over Arizona. The riders in the lot were settling in for the evening. Someone had gone for food. Others were talking about camping options, the self-organizing ease of people who travel and improvise. Hector Vega had opened his transmission shop and was letting people use his bathroom, which was Hector all over. Marcus Kane reappeared at Jake's side. He had been on the phone for the last hour. His expression was the expression of a man who has just come out of a significant negotiation with something. Mercer's attorneys came back, Marcus said. He'll negotiate on all 14 businesses. Jake looked at him. All of them, Marcus repeated, and the medical billing fraud he's agreeing to included in the scope. A pause. He's not admitting liability yet. That comes in the actual settlement terms, but he's agreeing to the scope. Marcus paused. Jake, this is real. Jake looked at his garage, at his father's name above the door, at Emma who was talking to Gloria Reyes with both of them laughing now. Laughing the real kind, not the managed kind, the kind that happens when relief meets humor in a body that has been holding tension for too long. He looked at the photograph in the window of his office, just visible from where he stood. His father, 1974, shaking hands with a man on a motorcycle somewhere in New Mexico. He had looked at that photograph 10,000 times in his life. He had never known who the man on the motorcycle was. He thought about that for a moment, about his father shaking hands with a stranger on a motorcycle on a road. Some things run in families. Tell them we'll meet Monday, Jake said, our terms, our timeline. And Marcus, he looked at him. Make sure Diane Ruiz is at that meeting. The AG doesn't leave the room. Marcus nodded slowly. You're not just fighting for the garage anymore. I never was, Jake said, and realized as he said it that it was true, that it had always been true from the moment he said, bring her into a stranger at midnight, that this was never only about one building on one road. It was about what the building meant, what the road meant, what it cost to build something, and what it meant to hold it. The sun finished going down. The lot across the road lit up with phone screens and laughter and the particular warmth that a group of people generates when they have gathered for a reason and know it. Someone had brought a guitar. Jake could hear it faintly. He stood at the door of Harrison's garage as the first stars appeared and thought Carol would have had a plan, and the plan would have looked something like this, and she would have executed it with more grace than he had managed, but she would have recognized it. She would have recognized the shape of it, the fact that doing the right thing fully and without half measures in the worst moment you have is the mechanism by which other right things become possible. She would have recognized it. He was fairly certain she would have approved. Monday came the way important days always come, ordinary on the surface, unremarkable in its early hours, the kind of morning where the coffee tastes the same and the light comes in the same way, and nothing about the atmosphere tells you that what happens today will be a line in the story of your life that everything else gets measured against. Jake was at the garage by 6. He hadn't planned to be there that early. Marcus had said the meeting was at 10 at the law offices in Kingman Neutral Ground, chosen specifically because Jake's garage had too much emotional weight for a room where Mercer's attorneys needed to feel like they were doing business rather than surrendering. But Jake had driven there at 6 anyway because it was his garage and it was Monday, and that was where he went. He made coffee. He stood at the workbench. He looked at his father's photograph. Emma called at 7:15. How are you? Oh, fine. That's not an answer. I'm functional, he said. That's the honest version. A pause. I'll be there by 9. We'll drive together. You don't have to, Dad. Her voice had the particular patience of a woman who has said this specific sentence many times and has made peace with the fact that she will say it many more. I'm coming. At 7:52, Marcus Kane called. I need to tell you something before we get in that room, Marcus said. His voice had the same focused quality it had carried since the beginning, but underneath it today, there was something else, a careful deliberateness that told Jake this was information Marcus had been weighing how to deliver. Tell me, Jake said. Diane Ruiz called me last night at 11. The AG's office has been going through Mercer's full acquisition history, not just the 14 businesses we identified, not just the 2 shell companies. The full history going back to when Consolidated Southwest Holdings was incorporated in 2019. A pause. Jake, there are 31 businesses, not 14, 31 properties along the 66 corridor and adjacent roads over 6 years. And in 11 of those cases, the original debts were artificially inflated before Mercer's companies acquired them. Jake stood very still at the workbench. Artificially inflated, he said. Coordinated with the original creditors, Marcus said. We believe, and Diane's team is still building this out, that in certain cases, including yours, the original debt holder was offered a financial arrangement to increase the stated balance before selling, so that when Mercer acquired it at a discount, The inflated number was already established in the paperwork. A beat. Jake, Carol's 60,000 may not have started as 60,000. The garage was very quiet. How much? Jake asked. We don't know yet. Priya is working through every line item against the actual insurance records and the hospital's internal billing logs, which the AG subpoenaed Friday. Marcus paused. But I wanted you to know before we walked into that room, because Mercer's attorneys are going to make an offer today, and I need you to understand that the offer they make is going to be based on what they think we know. And we may know more than they think we know. Jake looked at the coffee can of spare bolts on the second shelf from the left. He thought about Carol writing in the margin of a billing statement from her hospital bed. Asked Jake to check this. $4,400 difference on line 14. She had known, not the full scope of it, but she had known something was wrong, and she had written it down, and she had been right, and she had died without anyone ever checking it properly. I'm going to need a minute, Jake said. Take it, Marcus said. Jake set the phone on the workbench and stood with his hands flat on the metal surface. He breathed. He let the information land, let it settle into the full weight of what it was, because the only way through a thing like this is through it, not around it. And he had learned that in the 14 months since Carol, and he wasn't going to unlearn it now. When he picked the phone back up, he said, whatever offer they make today, it's not enough unless it covers everyone, all 31. And I want the medical billing fraud addressed in writing as part of the settlement with the original creditor named. That is a significantly harder ask than what we discussed Saturday, Marcus said. I know. Mercer may walk. You said that Saturday too. I mean it more today. Marcus, Jake's voice was steady. You told me the first night that Dylan Cross sized me up in 6 hours better than most people manage in a lifetime. I'm going to tell you something about Dylan Cross. He pushed a broken motorcycle 1.5 miles in the Arizona desert at midnight because leaving it on the road was not something he was willing to do. He didn't calculate whether it was worth it. He already knew the answer. Jake paused. I already know the answer too. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then I'll see you at 9. Emma arrived at 8:50. She looked at her father in his good clothes. He owned 3 button-down shirts without grease on them, and he was wearing the best one, dark blue, the one Carol had bought him for their anniversary 5 years ago. And she said nothing about the shirt, but her eyes said she recognized it, and that was enough. They drove to Kingman together. Emma drove because Jake's hands were steadier when he wasn't also navigating, and Emma understood that without being told. Are you scared? She asked on the highway. No, Jake said, and then because she deserved honest a little, not of Mercer, of hoping too much and having it fall short. Emma nodded. That's the right thing to be a little scared of. What's your mother's version of what we're about to do? He asked. Emma thought about it for a moment. She'd say go in knowing what you want, say it plainly, don't apologize for it, and don't leave without a clear answer either way. A pause. And she'd say bring snacks because long meetings make you stupid. She held up a paper bag from the same breakfast place as before. Jake almost smiled. You are very much her daughter. I know, Emma said. I'm working on being more of your daughter too. That one landed quietly and stayed. The law offices were on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Kingman, and the conference room had a long table and too many chairs, and the particular temperature of rooms where difficult things are negotiated, which is always slightly too cold, because cold keeps people from getting comfortable, and discomfort keeps meetings moving. Mercer's team was already there. Vincent Holloway, the attorney who had called Jake's cell Monday morning and gotten 3 words, sat at the far end of the table with 2 associates and a woman Jake didn't recognize, who turned out to be a forensic accountant. The forensic accountant's presence told Jake something important. Mercer's side already knew about the billing records. Diane Ruiz was there from the AG's office with a younger attorney named Santos, who said nothing and watched everything. Marcus sat beside Jake. Emma sat beside Marcus, which Holloway had not expected, and which he processed with the particular adjustment of a man recalibrating who he's dealing with. Grant Mercer was not there. Jake noted that immediately. Mercer had sent his attorneys, which meant one of 2 things. Either Mercer considered this below his personal involvement, or Mercer had been advised that his presence would escalate rather than resolve. Jake suspected the second. Holloway opened. He was professional and controlled and said things in the careful language of lawyers who are authorized to negotiate but not to admit, which meant every sentence had the quality of a door open precisely 3 inches enough to look through, not enough to walk through. Marcus listened to the opening without expression for 4 minutes. Then he said, "Mr. Holloway, we appreciate the professional language. Let me save us some time by telling you what we know." He laid it out. Not everything. Marcus Kane did not show all his cards at once. That was not how the man operated, but enough. The 2 shell companies, the 31 properties, the coordinated inflation of original debt balances, the AG's subpoena of hospital billing records, the forensic accounting review of Carol Harrison's medical debt. Holloway's face did not change dramatically, but the forensic accountant looked at her notepad in a way that told Jake she had not expected Marcus to have the 31 number, and that number was significant. "My client," Holloway said carefully, "is prepared to offer a resolution that addresses the immediate matters of concern." The immediate matters, Marcus said, are 31 families and businesses who were systematically defrauded. The resolution has to address all of them. He paused. "And the Harrison medical debt has to be part of the written terms with full accounting and appropriate restitution." Holloway looked at his associates. A conversation happened in the language of small glances and micro-expressions that lawyers develop over years of sitting in rooms together. "We need a recess," Holloway said. "Of course," Marcus said. They filed out. The AG's attorneys stayed. Diane Ruiz looked at Marcus and said very quietly, 31. 31, Marcus confirmed. "We had 22 confirmed," Diane said. "The other 9 are new to us. I'll send you everything by end of day." Jake sat in the cold conference room and ate half a breakfast burrito from Emma's paper bag and felt for the first time in the entire sequence of events that had begun with a stranger at midnight, something approaching stillness. Not calm, not resolution, not the end of anything, just a pause in the constant forward motion, a breath in the middle of the sentence. "You okay?" Emma asked quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Tell me something normal." Emma thought for a second. "Pete Galvez called me this morning. He wants to know if you'd be willing to teach a basic car maintenance class at the community center. He's already talked to the director, said something about how if more people knew how to take care of their own vehicles, there'd be less opportunity for people like Mercer to exploit them when they're financially desperate." She paused. "He'd already designed the flyer." Jake looked at her. He designed a flyer. He had his granddaughter make it on the computer. It says, "Harrison's Garage Community Auto Class, know your car, know your rights." Emma kept her face straight. She added a little cartoon wrench. Jake looked at the ceiling. Something that had been tight in him for a very long time loosened just slightly. "Pete Galvez," he said to no one in particular. "He also told me," Emma continued, "that he's been telling everyone on the corridor about you since Saturday and that 3 new customers have already called the shop." The recess lasted 26 minutes. When Holloway's team came back in, something in their posture had changed. Not defeat. Lawyers of that caliber don't show defeat, they show adjustment. But the room's geometry had shifted and everyone felt it. Holloway set a revised proposal on the table. Marcus read it. He passed it to Jake. Jake read it. Emma read it over his shoulder. Diane Ruiz's attorney Santos read it on the copy Holloway's associate slid to the AG's side of the table. The proposal covered all 31 properties. It included full debt forgiveness for all affected parties, restitution of fees and penalties collected under the fraudulent terms, and a structured fund for documented losses, including consequential business damages. For the Harrison case specifically, it included full restitution of all medical billing overcharges to be determined by joint forensic review, with a minimum guarantee floor that made Jake's breath stop for a moment when he read the number. The minimum guarantee floor was higher than the entire original debt. Holloway said this is a comprehensive resolution. In exchange, all parties agreed to a confidentiality provision regarding the specific terms. "No," Jake said. Everyone looked at him. "No confidentiality," Jake said. "The AG's investigation is public record. The Republic story runs Thursday regardless. A confidentiality provision serves no one except Grant Mercer's reputation, and his reputation is not something I'm interested in protecting." Holloway looked at him with the expression of a man who has been surprised. "Mr. Harrison, the confidentiality provision is standard in settlements of this, not in this one," Jake said. He looked at Diane Ruiz. "The AG's intervention remains on the public record regardless." "Correct." Correct, Diane said. Jake looked back at Holloway. Then the settlement terms don't need to be confidential to protect my interests. The only purpose of confidentiality here is to allow Mercer to conduct business elsewhere without this following him. He paused. Remove the confidentiality provision and we have a deal. The silence in the conference room lasted long enough to have its own texture. Holloway gathered his papers, another look at his associates. Then he said, "Give me 10 minutes." 10 minutes became 20. At the 20-minute mark, Holloway came back in alone. His associates stayed in the hallway. "The confidentiality provision is removed," he said. "My client agrees to public record settlement on all terms as written." Marcus looked at Jake. Jake looked at the table. He thought about 31 families. He thought about Gloria Reyes standing in Frank DeLuca's diner saying she didn't want to be afraid anymore. He thought about Carol's handwriting in the margin of a billing statement. "We have a deal," Jake said. The paperwork took 2 hours. Documents signed, initialed, witnessed, filed. Diane Ruiz's office would maintain oversight of the restitution fund distribution. Marcus would coordinate the notification of all 31 affected parties. The forensic joint review of Carol's billing records would begin within 15 days. When the last page was signed, Holloway gathered everything with the efficiency of a man completing a transaction and not lingering over it. He nodded at Marcus, professional to professional, and at Jake, and then he and his associates left. Grant Mercer never appeared. Jake understood that was intentional. Mercer was a man who acquired and divested, who operated through instruments and intermediaries, who had constructed his entire operation on the premise that distance from the human cost of what he did was both possible and sustainable. He had sent attorneys because he could not sit across from Jake Harrison and look at what 31 families and a dead woman's billing records actually meant when you were in the room with them. Jake didn't need him there. It was enough that it was done. Outside the building in the parking lot, Marcus put his hand out and Jake shook it. Marcus's grip was firm and brief and said everything that needed saying. "What happens to Mercer now?" Emma asked. "The AG's investigation continues regardless of the civil settlement," Marcus said. "Civil and criminal are separate tracks. This settlement resolves the civil claims. What the AG pursues criminally is Diane Ruiz's call." He looked at Jake. "But I'll tell you this, 31 documented cases of coordinated debt fraud involving collusion with original creditors is not a number that tends to stay civil." Jake nodded. "And the billing fraud," Emma said. "The hospital and Southwest Medical Financial Services are separately exposed," Marcus said. "That review starts in 15 days, and whatever it finds becomes part of the AG's file." He looked at Emma with something that was close to respect. "Your mother started that when she wrote that note in the margin. I want you both to know that." Emma looked at Jake. Jake looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "She was always right about the numbers," he said. Driving back, Emma kept the radio off. The highway ran straight through the desert the way it always had, the way it would keep doing long after all of them were gone, and Jake watched it through the windshield and let the morning settle into him. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he now recognized as Dylan Cross. He read it. "Heading home. Kansas first, then back to my place in Colorado. Going to start planning the spring ride. Same route Roy would have taken. Wichita to Malibu. If you want in, let me know by March. No pressure. Roy always said the best rides are the ones you almost don't take." Jake read it twice. He looked out the window at the highway and thought about Roy Briggs saying next summer for 20 years. He typed back, "I'll let you know by March." He put the phone in his pocket. At 2 in the afternoon, he pulled into the parking lot of Harrison's garage. He sat in Emma's car for a moment and looked at the building. At the sign, at the name his grandfather had painted above the door 66 years ago, and that still read clearly in Without Apology Harrison's. Emma sat beside him. She didn't rush him. "I keep waiting for it to feel finished," Jake said. "Does it?" He thought about that honestly, about the forensic review starting in 15 days. About 31 families waiting to hear from Marcus's office. About a court hearing that was now a settlement, and a settlement that was now public record, and a public record that would run in the Republic on Thursday alongside a photograph of a mechanic and his daughter standing in front of a garage on Route 66. About a spring ride from Wichita to Malibu that he hadn't said yes to yet, but also hadn't said no to. About Carol's handwriting in a margin. About his father's hands in a photograph. about a stranger at midnight with $52 and a dead man's last wish, who had looked at him with creekwater eyes and said, "Bring her in." "It doesn't feel finished," he said. "It feels like it kept going. Like one thing held, and then everything connected to it held, and now it's bigger than what it started as." He paused. "That's not finished. That's something else." "What?" Emma asked. He thought about Dylan's text. "The best rides are the ones you almost don't take." "It's forward," he said. "It just keeps going forward." He got out of the car. He went inside his garage. He put on his coveralls, the ones with Harrison's embroidered on the chest pocket in the same thread his father had used, and he picked up a wrench and he got back to work. Rosa Contreras needed her blazer back. Pete Galvez's magazine rack needed new magazines. The second bay needed a new fluorescent tube that had been flickering for 2 weeks. There was an oil change scheduled for 3 o'clock for a man named Gary Fitch, who Jake had never met before, a new customer, one of the 3 Pete had mentioned, who'd called since Saturday. The garage filled with the sounds of work, the particular sounds that Harrison's garage had been making for 66 years, the sounds that Jake Harrison had grown up breathing, that his daughter had taken her first steps on this concrete floor, hearing that Carol had walked into 1,000 Friday lunchtimes and felt at home in, because it was where Jake was most himself, and she had always known exactly who she was in relation to who he most was. The sounds that Grant Mercer had tried to silence. At 3:05, Gary Fitch arrived for his oil change. He was 63 years old, recently retired, with the look of a man who has recently discovered that retirement is not the relief he expected it to be. He shook Jake's hand and looked around the garage and said, "My wife heard about this place from a friend, said it's the most honest shop on the highway." "I try to be," Jake said. "She said more than that," Gary said. "She said something about a motorcycle and a lawyer and 100 bikers." He looked at Jake with the slight uncertainty of a man who isn't sure whether the story is real. "Is that true?" Jake looked at him for a moment. "Most of it," he said. "You want the full story or you want your oil changed?" Gary Fitch smiled, the real kind, the kind that takes a person off guard in the best way. "Can I have both?" "Yeah," Jake said. "You can have both." He pulled the car into the bay. He got under it, and he started talking the way his father had talked while he worked easy and honest, the way a man talks when he's on solid ground and knows it when the place he's standing is his and has been earned and will be defended as many times as defending is required, because some things are worth exactly that. Harrison's garage was still Harrison's garage. The name above the door said so. The work inside proved it. And the road out front, Route 66, 2 lanes of American asphalt that had carried 100 years of people toward what they were looking for, kept running the way it always had, carrying everyone who had enough courage to get on it toward wherever they were trying to go. That was always going to be enough. That had always been the whole point.